Nobody told you the truth about what happened this week. Not the networks, not the press briefings, not the departure statements written by communications offices whose only job is to manage what you believe. Two stories broke inside Washington that are being framed as routine. Neither of them are. One involves a woman who spent years building a reputation for steadiness and left in silence. The other involves a clock that started ticking and may not stop before something very large breaks. Both have documents behind them. Both have a version the official channels offered and a version the record actually supports. And by the time you understand what those documents show, you will realize this was the week two very different dominoes started moving in the same direction at once. Pam Bondi was supposed to be the steady hand. That was the framing from the beginning. Experienced, reliable, the kind of appointment that signals an administration trying to project stability. She understood the law and she understood the political environment the law operates inside. The appointment made sense on paper. It made sense in the briefing rooms. It made sense everywhere except, eventually, in the documents. Here is what the public record actually shows. In the weeks before the departure announcement, three things happened quietly. The first was a series of oversight inquiries from congressional offices. These were not public. They were not announced. They generated internal response documents that entered the public record through routine disclosure processes that almost no one monitors unless they know exactly what they are looking for. The second was a legal brief filed in a tangentially related matter that referenced the department's enforcement position in a way that created visible tension with statements made in earlier proceedings, not a direct contradiction that anyone highlighted. The kind of tension that lawyers notice immediately and everyone else walks straight past. The third was a scheduled appearance before a Senate subcommittee that was postponed, twice, in a single month. In Washington, when a senior official postpones a congressional appearance twice in 30 days, it is never a scheduling conflict. It is always something being managed. None of these things alone tells you the complete story. Together, they tell you enough of it. The official version of the exit was clean, amicable, a matter of natural transition and timing. Every communications office in Washington keeps that template ready. It goes out when the real explanation is something that nobody involved wants to put into a formal document. But here is how you read a departure in Washington when you know what to look for. When a senior official leaves on genuinely good terms, the tributes come fast and they come loud. Colleagues issue statements. The White House expresses gratitude in specific personal terms. You have seen it before. You know exactly what it looks like. That is not what happened here. What happened was measured, formal, correct in every procedural sense, and completely empty of the warmth that genuine exits produce. The kind of institutional quiet that anyone who has watched these transitions closely recognizes immediately, not as evidence of wrongdoing, as evidence that the story is more complicated than the version being offered. Her defenders are right about one thing. The environment she operated in was genuinely difficult. Decisions that are now subject to quiet scrutiny were made in real time under real pressure with incomplete information. That context matters. But context does not rewrite the documentary record. It sits alongside it. And the documentary record includes those oversight inquiries, that legal brief, those two postponed appearances, and a departure statement that answers none of the questions they raise. What happens next is the part that matters most. Who steps into the role, how the pending oversight inquiries resolve. Whether the congressional offices that generated those early document requests press further or let the matter settle. Departures in Washington rarely end the stories that preceded them. They change who is responsible for answering the questions. So long, Pam Bondi. But this chapter is not closed. Now Iran, because the Iran story is the one that should be keeping everyone awake. 60 days. That is the timeline that came out of the administration's diplomatic posture this week. 60 days to reach a framework agreement on the nuclear file. 60 days before, in the language coming from official channels, other options remain on the table. Other options. In diplomatic language, that phrase has exactly one meaning. Everyone in every foreign ministry on the planet knows what it means. No one is pretending otherwise. Here is the number that foreign policy analysts keep returning to. Most military campaigns that history records as brief lasted longer than 60 days. The Gulf War air campaign ran 42 days and was considered extraordinarily fast by any modern standard. The Falklands conflict lasted 74 days. These are the short wars. The reference points historians use when they talk about speed, and they were still longer than the window being offered to Tehran. That comparison is not meant to suggest military action is imminent. It is meant to expose the central problem with this deadline. 60 days is not a negotiating timeline. It is a pressure mechanism, and pressure mechanisms work differently than negotiating timelines. Different logic, different risks, different failure modes. Iran's nuclear program is not a single issue. It is a layered set of interdependent questions that have resisted resolution for decades because each layer connects to the others in ways that make isolated concessions nearly impossible to sustain politically on either side. There is the enrichment question, the inspection access question, which connects directly to Iranian sovereignty concerns that are not internally negotiable regardless of what external pressure looks like. The sanctions relief sequencing question, which matters enormously to Tehran because the last time a deal was reached and then dismantled, Iran lost economic relief it had already built into domestic planning. The regional proxy activity question, which Washington wants included in any comprehensive framework and which Tehran has consistently refused to negotiate as part of a nuclear agreement. And the domestic political situation inside Iran, where any agreement that reads as capitulation to external pressure faces resistance from factions that have more to gain from confrontation than from compromise. 60 days to resolve all of that is not a deadline. It is a deadline-shaped object performing a different function. Foreign policy analysts who have spent careers specifically on this file have been unusually direct this week, not in formal statements. In the background conversations and published analyses that reflect what people who actually understand the architecture of this problem think when they are not performing diplomatic optimism. Their consistent assessment is that this timeline serves a domestic political purpose more clearly than a diplomatic one. It creates visible pressure. It projects strength. It gives the administration something concrete to distinguish this approach from previous approaches that also failed. That does not make the approach wrong, but it changes what success and failure actually mean. A timeline designed primarily for domestic political effect produces different pressure than a timeline designed for diplomatic resolution. When those two things diverge, the consequences land internationally, regardless of the domestic calculation that produced them. History shows three outcomes follow hard deadline ultimatums in complex diplomatic situations with remarkable consistency. The first is that the deadline slips and gets reframed. New information surfaces. A technical conversation opens that requires more time. Washington has done this before. The institutional language for it is already written and ready. The second is a surface agreement, a document vague enough that Tehran presents it domestically as a defense of sovereignty and Washington presents it domestically as a meaningful constraint. Both presentations are technically defensible. Neither reflects what the document actually commits anyone to do. These agreements tend to collapse in the implementation phase when the vagueness that made them politically possible becomes operationally impossible to work with. The third outcome is the one that no official will discuss publicly. The deadline becomes a point of no return that nobody intended to cross, but that the public commitment makes impossible to retreat from without a political cost that shapes every decision that follows in a direction nobody would have chosen from the beginning. The third outcome is what the people who understand this problem most deeply are losing sleep over right now. Israel is watching, not rhetorically. Israel's security establishment is actively engaged with what the 60-day clock means for their own decision calculus. Israel has consistently maintained it will not permit Iran to reach a specific nuclear threshold, regardless of what diplomatic processes are underway. If the clock expires without a framework and the other options language requires some visible response to maintain credibility, the downstream effects on Israeli decision-making are not predictable in the way that Allied coordination statements suggest. Russia and China are watching with interests directly opposed to what Washington is pushing for. Both have economic relationships with Iran that effective sanctions architecture disrupts. Both are engaged in their own conversations with Tehran that will not pause because Washington set a deadline. And Tehran is watching most carefully of all. Iran does not make decisions in 60 days on matters of national security. Not because they are slow, because they have a domestic political process that is not faster than the American one, simply because it is less visible on Western television. Khamenei does not issue nuclear policy decisions in response to American timelines. He issues them in response to Iranian domestic politics, economic conditions, and strategic calculations that predate this administration. A 60-day deadline that Tehran's decision-making architecture cannot structurally respond to does not produce a negotiated agreement. It produces a structural failure dressed as a diplomatic one. Watch what happens at day 30. That is the moment when the shape of the real outcome becomes visible. Not in official statements, in what stops being said. in which back-channel conversations accelerate and which go quiet. In the language from allied capitals that shifts in ways tracking the internal temperature of the negotiation more accurately than anything Washington produces officially. Here is what ties these two stories together, because they are not separate stories dressed up as a single broadcast. Bondi's departure and the Iran deadline share one structural feature. Both involve a public commitment that ran into a private reality the commitment did not fully account for. In the Bondi case, the commitment was to a set of positions that the developing legal and oversight environment made progressively harder to sustain. In the Iran case, the commitment is to a timeline that the structural reality of Iranian decision-making cannot accommodate in the way the public framing suggests. Commitments create pressure. They signal seriousness. But commitments made without full accounting for the complexity underneath them do not disappear when that complexity surfaces. They become the gap between the story that was told and the story that is actually unfolding. That gap is what this week was about. The documents exist. The clock is running. And the version that the public record actually supports is becoming harder to contain behind the version that official Washington is still trying to tell. Stay close. What comes next in both of these situations will move faster than anyone is currently prepared for. The departure was not routine, the deadline is not what it appears, and the 60 days counting down are not just Iran's problem, they are everyone's.